Abii Tah She is a doctoral researcher in politics and international studies, working on how the agency and vulnerability of conflict-affected migrants reshapes understandings of conflicts and stability prospects in Africa. She focuses on Cameroon's Anglophone conflict and is looking at how migrants contest belligerent violence, negotiate institutional approaches to humanitarianism, and intervene in the politicization of conflict semantics. Her work is aiming to further debates on grassroots approaches to peace building, which are increasingly salient in the current era of international retreat and declining multilateralism. Beyond academia, Abii Tah founded Faces of Audacity in 2023, a humanitarian initiative that delivered relief to hundreds of displaced people affected by the conflict in Cameroon. Her commitment to widening access also extends to mentorship. She's co-chair of the Cambridge African Mentorship Program and oversaw the mentorship of 147 prospective African students, many of whom were successful. Similarly, as part of the core team of the pre-application mentorship project, Abii Tah contributed to the training of over 600 aspiring postgraduate African students, co-created an application toolkit, which was accessed by over 10,000 users and strengthened the participants' chances of securing a MasterCard Foundation scholarship at Cambridge. Her research and service contributions have been recognized with last year's Amit Bhasin Prize for an Outstanding African Scholar and the Cambridge Student Union Award for contributions to access and widening participation. Abii, thank you.
Everybody. Thank you so much for the wonderful introduction. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Abii Tah Bih, and I am a fourth-year PhD student in the Department of Politics and International Studies. And my research reappraises migrants' agency, vulnerability, and influence in Cameroon's Anglophone conflict. In November 2016, teachers and lawyers in the English-speaking regions of Cameroon peacefully protested against the socioeconomic extractivism, the political alienation, and the cultural erasure of the Anglophone minority Cameroonians by the Francophone-dominated government. These demonstrations, unfortunately, were met with state-sanctioned repression, arrests, and brutality, pushing a civil crisis into a full-scale separatist conflict between armed secessionist groups and military forces. Since then, the conflict has seen over 6,000 deaths, over 1 million displaced, over 2.2 million people out of a total Anglophone population of 5 million in dire humanitarian need. We've seen that over 300,000 children have not seen the four walls of a classroom since 2016, because less than 30% of schools are functional. Now, despite this scale, the world has overwhelmingly and resoundingly remained silent. The Norwegian Refugee Council in 2018, in 2019, and in 2024 declared the Anglophone conflict the world's most neglected displacement crisis because it receives negligible media coverage, it receives limited funding, and political will at the state and international levels is really low to resolve the conflict. When the conflict started, my brother, just 12 years old at the time, was trapped in a boarding school in the conflict zones. One afternoon, armed separatist fighters stormed his school. They, in one fell swoop, uprooted his gate and marched straight into the dormitories. They held everybody hostage, intending to recruit the students for marches. But after much pleading, thankfully, they resorted to ordering immediate shutdowns and asking the students to evacuate within hours. That night, my brother would be safely, thankfully, smuggled out of the conflict zones. And when next I would meet him, he would be the first displaced person I would ever know. After that, I would move to the US to start my university education. I would become a Cameroonian diaspora member. I would instinctively and immediately rally all my resources around my brother, immediately evacuating him in 2022 to the US, where he would start his university education, which I would fund as I proceeded with my PhD. As I helped my brother rebuild his life, I realized that our story was not unique. Across the diaspora, Cameroonians were rallying and mobilizing support for refugees and IDPs. My curiosity, therefore, drew me to the epistemologies on migrant roles in conflicts. And that's where I realized that there were two gaps emerging. First of all, diaspora members like myself are often deemed as powerful agentic actors who shape conflict dynamics, whereas IDPs like my brother and refugees are often perceived as passive victims of conflict with no ability to shape conflict dynamics. Scholars, secondly, also tend to see agency and vulnerability in migrant groups as distinct, as mutually exclusive even. And so my research approach was to think of agency and vulnerability as a dialectic, as interrelated, in order to confront and complicate scholarly assumptions of migrant roles in conflicts. So that brings me to my research question, which was, how might centering the experiences and interactions of IDPs, refugees, and diaspora members in Cameroon's Anglophone conflict reappraise their influence in the conflict's dynamics? To tackle my inquiry, I conducted field work across 10 cities in 4 different countries: the US, the UK, Cameroon, and Nigeria. I interviewed over 200 IDPs, diaspora members, refugees, separatist fighters, government officials, and more. To recruit my participants, I lived in refugee camps, I worked for NGOs, and I visited and interviewed at social spaces, so churches, schools, and markets, bars, among others. So I examined migrant experiences and interactions across 3 key domains in the conflict: the humanitarian domain, the discursive domain, as well as the security domain. In the humanitarian domain, IDPs described how vulnerability enables them not only to champion relief efforts locally, but also to confront humanitarian organizations that were predatory. This was the case of Mr. Kingsley, for instance. Mr. Kingsley he had suffered a violent arson attack in the conflict that took the lives of his pregnant wife and his child. It also left his body badly burnt. Upon fleeing to Yaoundé, Mr. Kingsley encountered a lot of humanitarian organizations that ended up scamming and exploiting him. During our interview, feeling very helpless, Mr. Kingsley described to me his intentions to strip naked and to protest in front of these organizations' buildings in Yaoundé. He anticipated that when people see the burns on his body, it would push them to react, and it would push outrage, public outrage, which would in turn cause accountability for these organizations. We see a similar case in the security domain, where IDPs like Mr. and Mrs. Nyoy talk about the ways that they use their vulnerability to de-escalate conflict violence. They talk about how their narratives of vulnerability enable them to actually convince armed separatist fighters to leave the bushes where they are hiding and to shelter themselves with them and undergo community-led rehabilitation processes, which these fighters themselves admit that these processes are much more trustworthy than the government's rehabilitation processes. In the discursive domain, we see the ways that refugees like Mrs. Kiven talk about how their simple, vulnerable presence in refugee camps is enough to challenge the international silence on narratives in the conflict. And it also is helpful in the ways that it allows them to push back on state propaganda and narratives around the conflict, because it creates a sense of visibility when they are suffering in these spaces. So overall, my findings actually also showed that across all domains, diaspora members suffer from the lack of vulnerability, ironically. Armed separatist fighters like General Daibodi declared that when diaspora members are seeming or presumed to be richer, presumed to be safer because of their distance, their politics becomes delegitimized on the ground. And several civilians also demonstrated that unless the diaspora is able to come to Cameroon and actively partake and share in conflict risks, then there is no reason why they should be partaking in the conflict's politics. They should restrict themselves to humanitarian support. So overall, my findings show that when strategically mobilized, vulnerability enables migrants to lead relief efforts, to confront predatory organizations, to reshape conflict discourse, and to rehabilitate and de-escalate armed fighters. However, when vulnerability is presumed absent, we see the ways that legitimacy and authority become remediated. So Three things emerge from these findings. First of all, vulnerability is not just a condition of suffering. Instead, it produces access and authority and legitimacy in ways that enable migrants to shape conflict. Secondly, vulnerability's potency lies in its legibility and its effectiveness, which is why organizations and states also scramble for it in conflicts, not just migrants. And these findings actually matter in the ways that we think about peace building in neglected conflicts, in conflicts where the state is unable to support peace because they are belligerent, or where organizations and states like the US are withdrawing from multilateral cooperation and withdrawing troops funding, and other resources from peace building. In such contexts, forcibly displaced persons actually fill the critical gaps. They use their vulnerable bodies, they use their vulnerable voices, they use their vulnerable presence to create pockets of peace and to uphold and sustain political futures. So how can we support them? The final part of my presentation actually talks about the ways that perhaps we can think about supporting them. I do not have all the answers yet, but when I started my fieldwork, I decided to extend the support that I was already giving my displaced brother to the broader displaced community. I started an organization called Faces of Audacity, which supports refugee-led and IDP-led organizations in Cameroon and Nigeria. So far, we have supported over 200 displaced migrants with scholarships, medical needs, vocational training, funding for businesses, and so forth. At the last Cam Africa Day, I was honored to receive the Dr. Amit Bhasin Prize, and I'm privileged to say that that prize money was spent on 2 events last month in Cameroon, where we were able to provide full-year school support to 40 IDP children. Ultimately, some of you might be asking, well, how do we resolve the conflict? I also do not have a simple answer to that question. However, my study hopefully is a reminder that it is the everyday acts of kindness, it is the everyday acts of civility, it's the everyday acts of compassion, especially from those who are the most vulnerable among us, that very crucially destabilize the frameworks, the social frameworks, humanitarian frameworks, political frameworks upon which violence is constituted and it thrives. So perhaps by foregrounding these everyday efforts by migrants, perhaps that is how we start to inch towards stability. Thank you very much.